The #1 and #2 pound-for-pound fighters in the world are going to be fighting each other this Saturday, Alexander Volkanovski versus Islam Makhachev, in order to determine who is the best fighter in the world. And a lot of people have opinions on this, but most believe that Islam Makhachev is going to run right through Alexander Volkanovski, who's coming up from a lighter weight class, who's going to be entering the fight probably 10 to 15 pounds lighter than Islam. And with Islam having his heavy wrestling style, which size and strength has a lot to do with, not many people see a lot of chances for Volkanovski to win this. But let's break down how can Volkanovski actually win this fight, and are his chances better than people are giving it? So right away on paper, Volkanovski has a major speed advantage, and he is a striker for the most part. He wants to avoid the ground game as much as possible, but he's of course training in case it gets there. He already made the comment that he's going to get taken to the ground, and it's going to come to his work in the gym of how to get back up to the feet. Islam is that good of a wrestler that even Volkanovski is saying right off the bat that he's going to get me down eventually. I got to find a way to deal with that. So he's already kind of surrendering that point. He knows that the inevitable is probably going to happen unless he gets like an early knockout, and that's always a possibility whenever you have a major speed advantage like this. People oftentimes just talk about power, like the force of a punch and stuff, when in fact a speed advantage can get you as many knockouts as someone who has more force in his punches, because you catch them when they're least expecting it and they take the full punch in a more relaxed state. And he can even knock out Islam Makhachev if he catches him in the right moment. So a sudden early blitz is always a gamble for Volkanovski to land early before Islam can react. This is always going to be a possibility. It's a high risk, high reward, because if it misses, if he blitzes in heavy and he gets way too overextended, Islam can take him to the ground and then things can get really murky for him there. That is a chance for him to win very early in the fight due to his blinding speed. But there are two other things that are disadvantages for Volkanovski. #1, he hasn't fought a wrestler at this level. He's fought 2 wrestlers in the UFC, Chad Mendes and Darren Elkins. Neither guy are on the level of Islam, let alone have his style. Completely different kind of wrestler at a completely different level, and those guys are much smaller than Islam, much weaker. The #2 thing is, he's never fought a southpaw. And Islam Makhachev is a southpaw fighter who doesn't really switch stances at all. The only quote-unquote southpaw fighter that he fought was Brian Ortega. But Brian Ortega is an orthodox fighter who took southpaw for that fight. He's not naturally left-handed like Islam, and he doesn't fight the same way even in his striking. But what's more important about looking at that fight is, what did Volkanovski do against that southpaw Ortega? The same exact stuff. His hand trapping was much more effective. He was throwing outside elite leg kicks, same exact stuff that he does pretty much against orthodox fighters, but just different targets now. But then again, we do have to say that Ortega was not just southpaw for that fight. The majority of the fight, it looked like he was southpaw, but still like nearly half of it, he was orthodox, which is a different dynamic than fighting Islam, who's going to take the whole fight in southpaw. So everything you're used to seeing from Volk when he fights Max Holloway, Max actually stood in orthodox for the majority of their fights. We see him fight Korean Zombie, Jose Aldo, Chad Mendes, etc. Everything he did in those fights are not against a southpaw fighter, so it's going to be a bit different for him. Some of his best weapons are the left hook, the jab, and the inside leg kick against that orthodox fighter, when all of these attacks are harder to land against a southpaw fighter, especially a southpaw that is defensive, because the jab alone is harder to land due to the fact that Islam is longer. He always has his lead right hand probing out there, touching yours to trap a jab from coming. He's very good at lifting up his shoulder in case a left hook is coming at him, and the inside leg kick now is going to come from the right leg from Volkanovski, unless he wants to throw the lead leg kick on the outside. But this can be a big issue if Islam grabs onto it. And here's something to note: when Volkanovski did throw that lead leg kick on Ortega before he got punched and taken to the ground into that guillotine later, remember that Ortega was southpaw in that moment. Ortega caught the kick, landed the left hand, and got the fight to the ground. This is something that Islam could do as well. So going into the fight, those are two things that Volkanovski doesn't have much experience against. But when we talk about his major weapons, the jab and lead leg kick are still weapons that can absolutely be effective in the fight if he's able to use his speed behind it and or eliminate Islam's right hand from trapping the jab. He can get right in there, the jab into a right cross, and catch Islam unexpectedly. And typically when he uses the jab and the leg kick, it's to find range for his own punches, or if he wants to react to yours, let's say defend your shots, evade it, all that stuff, as well as offset the opponent constantly. And he throws these very often. The majority of his strikes are jabs and lead leg kicks. And what comes with that is also hand trapping. he constantly hand traps. It's going to be easier for him to do it against a southpaw because the lead hands are right there next to each other. He's been doing this against orthodox fighters his entire career, and that's much harder and more dangerous to do against because their lead hand is right in front of your face when you're doing that. They can easily jab you or leap in with a long punch with their left hand. But against a southpaw, he's going to be at a further distance as he's hand trapping, so this actually is going to work to his benefit, and Islam and Volkanovski are going to be playing both of their own games because they're both very good at doing this. But when we get to the attacks, what can he actually land on Islam Makhachev here? A jab with a delay is so big for him here, man. This is enormous for him if he's able to make this work against Islam. He throws a jab, moves in as Islam is moving away from the attack, and Volkanovski delays to see Islam's response. Most of Islam's responses to whatever you throw at him is him to move away from the strike. You see this constantly throughout his entire career. He has good footwork, solid defense, good eyes to see what's coming, and if you can create a delay while keeping the jab in his face, similar to the way that actually Israel Adesanya did against Alex Pereira to catch him with the right hand at the end of the first round, that's exactly what Volkanovski would want to do here. Because if Islam's moving away in a straight line, let's say he leans away, he can enter behind that delayed jab and catch him with the right straight as well. He did this exact same thing to the Korean Zombie, where he was landing jabs for most of the fight. He was finally able to find his right straight when he delayed after his jab to move in. So that's one thing he could do with the delayed jab. The other thing he can do is hit Islam with the leg kick. If he's moving and leaning away, his legs are going to be exposed. There's a good leg kick for him to land on Islam without being worried about getting taken to the ground because Islam is not going to be in the kind of stance with the right balance to catch the kick and get that takedown. And finally, the last thing he can look for here is more of a devastating shot, and that is if Islam goes under the delayed jab to get a takedown, but Volkanovski sees that response because of his delay after the jab, and he intercepts the takedown with an uppercut. This is more of a risky move, but one that can have devastating outcome. Another thing that Islam could do as he's moving away is throw a counter right hook. This is something he constantly does for counter punches, is he throws a long right hook when you're trying to enter into him. But if Volkanovski keeps his punches straight, gets on the inside of those, he's able to land on Islam even more devastatingly. So that delayed jab is such a big weapon for Volkanovski, man. It leads up to great offense as well as keeps him in a safer position than most of the other things he can throw at Islam. It's the safest, most efficient way to land his strikes on Islam Makhachev. And remember, he always has that speed advantage, so Islam can always be in trouble whenever he tries to react to this. And like we talk about, the constant hand trapping is something that Volkanovski is going to want to do in the fight. He wants to feel Islam's head kick. He wants to feel the takedown from that range. Feel Islam's left straight that he oftentimes will throw out there if you're hand fighting with him. And Volkanovski, due to his high fight IQ, can figure some things out once he feels these attacks. And we'll talk about the takedown defense in a moment because of Volkanovski's shorter stature. But firstly, we have to note constant pressure is a must against guys like Islam and Khabib to make their takedowns easier to see coming, as their setups for the takedowns become more limited, and generally they do not do as well on the back foot. This is more for Khabib, not as much for Islam. Islam will still do some things in the back foot, but he's still much better on the front foot than the back foot, so you want to get him in the worst position possible, right? And no matter how good he is on the back foot, the takedowns are going to be easier to see coming regardless. And that comes the lower, shorter stature from Volkanovski. He probably wants to keep it even lower than usual to discourage the takedown shots in the center of the cage, due to the lowered stance being ready to defend takedowns at all times. Now, he doesn't want to lower his hands because you do still have to respect Islam's striking. Just like it showed in the Charles Oliveira fight, you cannot underestimate Islam's striking ability, especially with the guy being bigger than you as well. You definitely don't want to disregard his head kicks, his left straight, his right hook. You do not want to disregard those strikes. But a lowered stance is going to generally discourage the takedowns in the center of the cage as long as Volkanovski does not get backed up. If Volkanovski gets backed up, it's not even going to matter at that point. Due to the lower stance, Islam is going to have a harder time getting under Volkanovski at his hips. And it's going to make it easier for Volkanovski to sprawl or just evade the takedown altogether. Because as we know, just sprawling is not going to do enough. Guys with Islam's wrestling style don't just stop at one takedown. Their initial shot is usually just to create contact. And from there is when the real takedown comes. So sprawling on just the contact shot is not going to stop him from continuously trying to get that takedown, because his chain wrestling is stronger than his initial shot. Now, if it gets to the ground, what does a more modern Volkanovski look like? Because we could look back at the Chad Mendes fight, but it's really hard to take that Volkanovski and use it for a breakdown now. he was a completely different guy then. That's why I don't even think his takedown defense is as bad as it was then. Let's be honest, he was getting taken down very easily by Chad. You have to look at the fight with Ortega because it's the only time he was really on the ground for an extended period of time. And honestly, nothing that Volkanovski did on the ground gives me much confidence except for the fact that he could stay in a submission for a long time. But the issue that Ortega had that Islam definitely will not and never had was that he constantly looks for submissions before positions, whereas Islam does the exact opposite. Islam is going to try to keep himself on top of you before he tries for anything. Whereas Ortega, immediately after Volkanovski got out of the guillotine, Ortega was going into another choke without actually establishing a position first. Because the whole time he was going for the choke, Volkanovski was digging into that one leg to reverse the position, and Ortega never fought against it. He was just focused on getting that submission. And that is ultimately the end of the breakdown. So does Volkanovski have a better chance than most people are giving him? I believe he has a slightly better chance, but not completely. He definitely has a bigger path to victory than most people are thinking. But his weaknesses against Islam don't seem to be exaggerated. His strengths against Islam seem to be underestimated though.